The ground under my boots cracked before the alarm even started screaming. I grabbed the rope ladder with both hands as dust poured down from the tunnel ceiling like sand through a broken hourglass. 40 feet below me, Nora Fenwick was still on her knees in the mud, brushing away centuries of packed earth with her bare fingers, completely ignoring the fact that the chamber around her was folding in on itself. "Nora, move!" I shouted down into the dark. She didn't even look up. "Claire, look at this. Look at this before it's gone." I dropped the last 10 feet instead of climbing them, landing hard beside her in the flooding trench. Water was already rising around our ankles, cold and black, seeping in from somewhere the engineers hadn't mapped yet. Behind us, the support beams groaned like something alive and dying. And there, in the mud, glowing faintly under her flashlight, was a slab of stone unlike anything either of us had ever excavated. Not carved by hand, not weathered by wind, symbols that seemed to shift depending on the angle you looked at them, as if the stone itself was still deciding what it wanted to say. "We don't have time for this," I said, pulling at her arm. "We don't have time not to," she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, I heard real fear in her voice. Not fear of the tunnel collapsing, fear of what she'd just read. We got out with seconds to spare. The chamber caved in behind us, swallowing 3 years of careful excavation in under 10 seconds. Our entire team stood at the surface in silence, watching the earth settle over what used to be the deepest dig site in human history. Nora didn't cry. She didn't even breathe hard. She just stared at the photograph on her cracked tablet screen, the one picture she'd managed to take before we ran, and she said 4 words that changed everything. "It's not a ruin." I want to tell this story from the beginning because I think people deserve to know how close we came to losing everything without ever understanding why. My name is Claire Whitmore. I was a structural engineer assigned to the Kellwood Excavation Project, a joint research site funded by 6 different countries, built around the strangest geological anomaly ever discovered on Earth. We called it the Hollow, a perfectly circular depression 11 miles wide, buried under 300 feet of solidified rock that geologists insisted was impossible without volcanic activity nobody could find evidence of. Nora Fenwick was the reason I stayed on that project longer than my contract required. She was a linguist, technically, though that word never quite fit her. She spoke 9 languages fluently and could read 4 extinct ones, but what she was really good at was pattern recognition. She could look at scattered symbols from cultures thousands of years apart and find threads connecting them that nobody else could see. The kind of mind that made her either brilliant or exhausting to work with, depending on the day. For 2 years, the Hollow gave us nothing but questions. Layers of rock that didn't match any known geological period. Traces of metal alloys that shouldn't have existed before the Industrial Age, buried under sediment that was, by every dating method we had, older than the pyramids by tens of thousands of years. We found fragments of structure, walls that seemed to curve in ways that defied normal architecture, but nothing intact, nothing readable, until the day the chamber opened beneath our feet and nearly buried us both alive. That night, in the makeshift lab tent that smelled like wet canvas and burnt coffee, Nora spread the single photograph across 3 monitors and enhanced it until the pixels blurred at the edges. I sat across from her, still shaking dust out of my hair, watching her eyes move across the symbols like she was reading a letter from someone she used to know. "This isn't decoration," she said quietly. "This isn't a prayer or a myth or a king's name carved into a wall. Claire, this is structured. Look at the repetition here and here. This has grammar. This has clauses." "Clauses like a sentence?" "Clauses like a contract," she said. I laughed because it sounded absurd. A contract, buried under 300 feet of rock, older than written history, hidden beneath a hole in the ground that shouldn't exist. But Nora didn't laugh. She kept staring at the image, tracing one particular section of the carving with her finger, over and over, like she was trying to convince herself she wasn't imagining it. "There's a symbol here that repeats 12 times across this fragment alone," she said. "In every language I've ever studied, When something repeats that consistently in a structured text, it isn't a name, it's a category, a label, something being defined. Defined as what? She looked up at me, and I will never forget the way her face looked in the blue light of the monitor. Not excited, not thrilled with discovery the way she usually was. She looked like someone who had just realized the floor she was standing on wasn't the floor she thought it was. "I think it's defining us," she said. "I think this stone was written about the people who would eventually dig it up." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. We requested emergency funding to reopen a secondary access point to the collapsed chamber, and it took 11 days of round-the-clock excavation before we broke through to a second room, smaller than the first but completely intact. No water damage, no collapse, just walls covered floor to ceiling in the same shifting symbols, perfectly preserved, waiting. Waiting felt like the right word, even though I couldn't explain why. Nora worked 18-hour days translating fragments while structural teams reinforced every inch of the new chamber. She barely ate. She barely spoke to anyone except to ask for more light, more magnification, more time. I brought her food she didn't touch and coffee that went cold beside stacks of printed symbol charts. I watched her fill 3 notebooks with cross-references, comparing the Hollow script against Sumerian cuneiform, against Rongo from Easter Island, against a dozen other undeciphered writing systems from around the world that scholars had given up trying to translate decades ago. "They're related," she told me on the 9th day, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Not directly, not like one evolved into the other, but there's a shared root somewhere, Claire, something old enough and widespread enough that it touched cultures on opposite sides of the planet who never had contact with each other." "So people copied it?" "No, I don't think people wrote any of these first drafts at all." She turned her tablet toward me, showing a translation she'd pieced together from 3 different fragments, cross-referenced against a phrase structure she'd found repeated in stone circles on 2 different continents. The passage read, roughly, "Subject species, designation pending, planted on marked world under standard cultivation protocol, development to be observed at required intervals, final assessment upon reaching threshold indicators." I read it twice, then a 3rd time. "Planted," I said, "like a crop." "Like an experiment," Nora said. The tent felt colder than it had a moment before, even though nothing had changed except the words on a screen. I thought about every strange gap in human history that historians could never quite explain. The sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple unconnected regions within a suspiciously narrow window of time. The way early civilizations across different continents built structures aligned to the same celestial patterns despite having no way to communicate with each other. The countless myths, from cultures with no shared language or geography, describing beings who came from the sky to shape and guide early humanity. I had always assumed those were coincidences, patterns the human mind invents because we're wired to find meaning in chaos. Nora didn't think they were coincidences anymore, and once she said it out loud, I couldn't stop seeing the shape of it either. "If this is real," I said slowly, "if we were actually planted here, then this whole site isn't a ruin at all." "No," she said, sliding another photograph across the table, this one showing a section of wall with a symbol unlike any of the others, larger, centered, clearly meant to draw attention. "It's a case file, and whoever wrote it is planning to come back and read the final page." She tapped the symbol on the screen. It looked almost like a spiral folding into itself, elegant and deliberate, nothing like the jagged decorative carvings we usually found on ancient monuments. This one looked engineered, designed by someone who understood exactly what they wanted it to communicate to anyone capable of reading it. "What does that one mean?" I asked. Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring at the symbol like it might answer her back if she waited long enough. "I think it means judgment," she finally said. "I think it means the day this experiment gets graded." Outside the tent, the wind picked up, rattling the canvas walls, and somewhere in the dark, a generator hummed steadily, like nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed. Sitting there in that cramped, coffee-stained tent, staring at a photograph of a symbol carved by hands that weren't human, I understood for the first time that our entire history, every war we'd survived, every plague we'd endured, every invention we'd ever been proud of, might have been nothing more than data collected for someone else's report. Nora closed her notebook and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not fear exactly, something closer to resolve. "We need to find out how much time we have left," she said, "because I don't think this experiment is finished being watched. I think it's finished being run." None of us knew yet just how right she was, or how soon the ones who wrote that stone would come looking for their answer. The satellite call came through at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I even answered it that something had gone wrong somewhere else in the world, because nobody calls a research tent in the middle of the night with good news. It was Owen Blake, a geologist who had left our site 8 months earlier to join a separate excavation near a set of stone circles in northern Europe, one of dozens of sites that had suddenly attracted renewed international funding after word of our discovery leaked through academic channels faster than anyone could contain it. His voice was shaking. "Claire, is Nora awake?" "She hasn't slept in 3 days, Owen. Of course she's awake." "Put her on. Now." I handed Nora the phone, and I watched her face change as she listened, the color draining out of it in slow degrees. She asked him to repeat himself twice. Then she asked him to send images immediately, and within minutes, a set of photographs loaded onto her tablet showing a chamber almost identical to ours, thousands of miles away, carved with the same shifting symbols, the same spiral seal centered on the far wall. "They found their own case file," she said after she hung up, staring at the screen like she was trying to convince herself it was really happening. "Claire, this isn't isolated. It's not one strange chamber under one strange hole in the ground. It's everywhere." Over the following weeks, the pattern became impossible to deny. Teams at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey uncovered a lower level nobody had ever detected beneath the oldest known temple structure on the planet, and the carvings inside matched our script almost symbol for symbol. A research group studying the Nazca Plateau in South America found buried stonework beneath the desert floor containing the same spiral seal, oriented in a way that lined up precisely with astronomical calculations nobody could explain with ancient tools. Divers investigating an offshore anomaly near Japan surfaced with photographs of submerged stone structures that had clearly been carved by the same hand, or the same intelligence, regardless of how many oceans separated them. Nora built a wall of connections in the main tent, string and pins stretching between dozens of sites across 6 continents, every single one containing some version of the same message carved in the same impossible language. She barely left that tent for 2 weeks. I brought her meals she forgot to eat and reminded her to sleep more nights than I could count, but I understood why she couldn't stop. Once you see a pattern that big, ignoring it feels like willful blindness. "It's not random," she told me one evening, standing in front of her wall of string and photographs, her eyes red from exhaustion. "Every site follows the same structure, an entry chamber describing observation, a secondary chamber describing thresholds, and in the sites we've fully mapped, a third chamber we haven't found the entrance to yet." "What do you think is in the third chamber?" "I think that's where the verdict gets delivered." We assembled a joint international team, faster than any bureaucratic process should have allowed, which told me more than anything else how seriously governments were beginning to take this. Within a month, translators, historians, physicists, and linguists from a dozen countries were working together under careful supervision, all of us bound by strict secrecy agreements while we tried to piece together exactly what our ancestors had been part of without ever knowing it. The full picture, once Nora and her expanded team finished cross-referencing every site, was almost too large to hold in my mind at once. Long before recorded history, an intelligence far beyond anything humanity had ever imagined had selected certain worlds capable of supporting life and deliberately introduced conditions for that life to develop along controlled parameters. Not creation from nothing, cultivation of what already existed, shaped and guided at key intervals to see how it would grow. Earth, according to the earliest chambers, had been seeded during what the translated text called an initial cultivation phase, an era so ancient it predated even the earliest fossil evidence we had for early human ancestors. The beings who did this were referred to in the text only by a symbol Nora eventually translated as something close in meaning to cultivators, a word that felt almost gentle compared to what it actually represented. According to the chambers, the cultivators didn't create life from scratch. They found worlds already capable of sustaining it, and they nudged, guided, and occasionally intervened directly, shaping early development toward specific outcomes they were interested in measuring. The chambers described intervals, checkpoints scattered throughout history where the cultivators would return, observe, and record. Nora believed the sudden unexplained leaps in early human development, farming appearing in multiple regions almost simultaneously, the strange precision of ancient astronomical alignments, might not have been the achievements of isolated genius after all. They might have been guided corrections, nudges applied by an intelligence checking whether their experiment was progressing according to whatever standard they were measuring against. "It gets worse," Nora told the assembled team during a briefing 3 weeks after the first international sites were confirmed. She stood in front of a projected map showing every known chamber location, marked dots scattered across the globe like a pattern spreading outward. We found references, in at least 4 separate chambers, to previous trials, other worlds, other subjects. A researcher near the back of the room, a quiet physicist named Daniel Pierce, asked the question everyone else was too afraid to voice. What happened to them? Nora pulled up a translated fragment on the screen, one she had cross-referenced across 3 different chambers to be certain the translation was accurate. The text was short, and somehow that made it worse. Subject species designation 7, threshold assessment failed, cultivation terminated, world reclaimed for future seeding. The room went completely silent. I remember looking around at the faces of scientists and researchers from a dozen different countries, all of them staring at the same words, understanding for the first time exactly what termination and reclamation likely meant for a species that had failed whatever test it had been given. "How many others?" someone finally asked. "We've found references to at least 11 previous subject designations across different chambers," Nora said. "We don't know how many of those failed. We don't know how many succeeded. What we do know is that the chambers describe humanity as subject designation number 19, which means at least 18 other worlds came before us." I felt the weight of that number settle over the room like a physical thing. 18 other trials. 18 other species who had lived and grown and built entire civilizations, completely unaware that everything they did was being measured against a standard they never agreed to and never even knew existed. Over the following months, as more chambers were uncovered and more fragments translated, a clearer and far more unsettling picture began to emerge. The cultivators didn't simply observe passively. According to several chambers, they measured very specific criteria at each checkpoint, criteria that seemed designed to evaluate obedience to natural order, stability of social structure, and predictability of collective behavior. Species that developed in ways the cultivators considered chaotic, unpredictable, or resistant to external guidance were flagged as high-risk candidates for termination. "That's the part that troubles me," Nora admitted to me late one night, long after the rest of the team had gone to sleep, the 2 of us alone in the tent, surrounded by translated fragments, spread across every available surface. "Everything that makes us who we are, Claire, our art, our rebellion, our refusal to accept things exactly as we're told. According to this framework, that's not a strength. That's exactly the kind of behavior that gets a species marked as unstable." "So we're going to fail," I said quietly, "because we're too human." "Maybe," Nora said, "unless there's a way to change what the test is actually measuring." I didn't understand what she meant at the time, not fully, but I remember the look in her eyes that night, the same look she'd had staring at that first symbol back in the collapsed chamber. Not fear anymore, something sharper, something that looked almost like the beginning of a plan. 3 days later, everything accelerated in a way none of us were prepared for. An observatory in Chile detected an object entering the outer edge of our solar system, moving in a way that defied every model astronomers used to track natural celestial bodies. It wasn't an asteroid, it wasn't debris, it was slowing down in a controlled pattern, adjusting its path in ways that made it unmistakably clear that whatever it was being deliberately guided. Nora was the first person the astronomers called, because by then, everyone involved in the project understood exactly what an object like that might mean. She stood in front of the projected path data for a long time without saying anything, watching the calculated arrival window scroll across the screen. According to the projections, the object would reach Earth's orbit in a little over 4 months. "That's not a coincidence," she finally said. "That's the assessment date." "How do you know?" She pulled up one final translated fragment, one she had been saving, one she hadn't shown anyone yet, because she hadn't been certain enough of the translation to trust it. It came from the deepest chamber at our own site, the one we still hadn't found a way to fully access. Final observation cycle to commence upon return of the seeding vessel. Verdict to be rendered upon arrival. No appeal recognized within established protocol. No appeal, I repeated. So whatever they decide, that's it. There's no arguing with them. According to their own rules, no, Nora said. There's no appeal process because no subject species has ever known enough about the trial to attempt one. She looked at me then, and I saw something settle behind her eyes, some idea forming that I still didn't fully understand. "But we know now," she said. "We know the rules exist. We know the language they're written in. And if there's no appeal process built into their system, that doesn't mean we can't build one ourselves." And court. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because the idea sounded impossible. Reasoning with an intelligence capable of seeding entire worlds and erasing civilizations that failed to meet their standards. Using their own ancient language, carved in stone, to somehow change a verdict that had never once, in 18 previous trials, ended in anything other than success or termination. But Nora wasn't laughing. She was already pulling out a blank notebook, already sketching the first lines of a symbol that didn't yet exist in any chamber we had found. "They wrote the rules," she said. "That means the rules can be read both ways." 4 months. That was all the time we had left before the vessel that seeded our entire species arrived to read the final page of a case file none of us had ever consented to being part of. And somewhere in that quiet tent, surrounded by fragments of an ancient language written by beings who saw humanity as nothing more than an experiment, Nora Fenwick decided she wasn't going to wait quietly for a verdict. She was going to write one first. 4 months sounds like a long time until you try to build a legal defense for an entire species using a language that nobody alive had ever been taught to speak. Nora assembled a smaller group after that night, people she trusted enough to work through what remained of the deadline without wasting time on doubt or panic. Daniel Pierce stayed on to help model the incoming vessel's trajectory and timing. A quiet historian named Lucy Bramwell joined us from a university in London, someone who had spent her entire career studying failed civilizations and abandoned settlements, convinced there had always been a missing piece to explain their sudden collapse. And a translator named Grant Ashby, who had worked for years decoding damaged manuscripts nobody else could make sense of, became the second person after Nora capable of reading the cultivator script fluently. The 5 of us worked out of the reinforced chamber at our original site, now protected by round-the-clock security and heavy scanning equipment that monitored the incoming vessel's approach in real time. Somewhere out past the edge of our solar system, something ancient was moving steadily toward us, and every single day, the arrival window narrowed a little further. Our first real breakthrough came from Grant, 3 weeks into the new effort, while cross-referencing a section of the deepest chamber none of us had managed to translate cleanly before. "I think I found the actual grading criteria," he said one morning, sliding a printed page across the table toward Nora. "Not just the overview, the specific thresholds they're measuring against." Nora read it twice before she spoke. "This is worse than I thought." The passage, once fully translated, described 5 measurable categories the cultivators used to evaluate every subject species at final assessment. Stability of governance structure, predictability of collective behavior across large populations, absence of internal conflict beyond acceptable variance thresholds, compliance with natural resource limitations, and finally, a category that had no direct translation, something closest in meaning to convergence, meaning how closely a species had settled into a single unified way of thinking, behaving, and organizing itself. "They want uniformity," Lucy said, staring at the translated list. "They're not measuring intelligence or capability at all. They're measuring how well we've settled down into something predictable. And by every one of these standards," Grant added quietly, "we fail. Not barely, completely." He wasn't wrong. Human history was defined by conflict, disagreement, constant reinvention of governance structures, wildly different cultures refusing to align with one another, populations that behaved in ways no model could reliably predict. Every single category the cultivators used to measure success described exactly the things that made humanity chaotic and, according to their framework, dangerous. "So what happens if we fail?" Daniel asked, though I think everyone in that chamber already knew the answer none of us wanted to say out loud. Nora didn't answer directly. Instead, she pulled up the trajectory data on the main screen, the incoming vessel now close enough that its projected arrival date had narrowed to within a 2-week window. "We have less time than we thought," she said. "The vessel is decelerating faster than the models predicted. Daniel, how much do we actually have left?" He ran the updated numbers twice before answering. 11 weeks, maybe less if it continues adjusting speed the way it has been. 11 weeks, to somehow convince an ancient intelligence that humanity deserved to exist, using criteria specifically designed to guarantee that species like ours would fail. I remember sitting in that chamber, surrounded by symbols carved by beings who had already erased 18 other worlds, feeling like we were preparing an argument nobody would ever actually hear. It was Nora who found the thread that changed everything, buried in a fragment none of us had prioritized because it seemed, at first glance, like nothing more than procedural language. "Look at this," she said late one night, pulling Grant and me over to her workstation. "This section describes the trial protocol itself, not the criteria, the process, how the assessment actually gets conducted. The passage describes something none of the earlier chambers had mentioned. According to the deepest fragment, final assessment wasn't purely automatic. It required direct confirmation of the subject species status through what the text called a recorded declaration, a formal statement made in the assessment language, acknowledging the terms of the trial before judgment could be finalized. "They need us to accept the terms," Grant said slowly, reading it over again. "The verdict isn't automatic. There's a formal step where the subject species has to confirm understanding of the trial before the cultivators can act on their findings." "Why would they build in a step like that?" Lucy asked. "If they already control the outcome either way, why require confirmation at all?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring at the passage like she was turning it over from every possible angle. "Because this isn't just an experiment to them," she finally said. "It's a legal process, a trial in the truest sense of the word, and if it's a real trial, built on real procedure, then procedure can be challenged." "You think we can refuse the terms?" I asked. "I think we can respond to them," Nora said. "No previous subject species ever had the chance, because none of them ever understood what was happening until it was already too late. We're the first ones who found the chambers early enough to actually read the rules before the verdict arrived." It sounded impossible when she said it out loud, and yet the more we studied the structure of the trial, the more it started to look less like an experiment and more like an ancient legal framework, one built with formal procedures, established criteria, and language specifically designed for evaluation and response. If it truly functioned like a legal system, then somewhere within that system, there had to be room for argument. Every legal framework in human history, no matter how rigid, had exceptions, precedents, and interpretations that shifted depending on how convincingly a case was presented. "If they're grading us against a fixed standard," Nora said, standing in front of the projected translation, then the only way to change the outcome is to challenge the standard itself, not deny what we are, prove that what we are should count as success, not failure. How do you even begin to argue that? Lucy asked. Their entire framework treats our differences as instability. Nora walked to the section of wall where the earliest translated fragment had been printed and pinned since the very first week of the project. The passage describing 18 previous subject species, their failures, and their quiet termination. She stared at it for a long time before she answered. Every one of those species probably failed the same way, she said, because they tried to fit themselves into whatever mold the cultivators expected. They tried to prove stability, uniformity, predictability, and every single one of them still failed anyway, because you can't fake convergence toward beings capable of measuring it perfectly. So what's different about us? Grant asked. We're not going to try to fit their mold, Nora said. We're going to argue that the mold itself measures the wrong thing. The room went quiet. It was one thing to translate an ancient language. It was another thing entirely to propose rewriting the terms of a trial that had never once been challenged, by a species that had existed for less than a fraction of the time the cultivators had been running this experiment across the galaxy. They measure convergence as success, Nora continued, pacing now, her voice picking up speed the way it always did, when an idea was forming faster than she could speak it. But convergence isn't strength, it's fragility. A species that thinks with one mind can be destroyed by a single failure of that mind. A species that argues, disagrees, splits into 1,000 different approaches to every problem, that species survives because it never depends on any single idea being right. Our disagreement isn't instability. It's redundancy. It's the reason we've survived every disaster, every disease, every collapse that should have ended us permanently. Grant leaned forward, already reaching for a blank sheet to begin drafting translation structure. You want to write a counter-argument, in their language, using their own legal framework. I want to write a declaration, Nora said, not accepting their terms as written, presenting a different standard, one that redefines what successful cultivation actually means. And if they reject it? Lucy asked quietly. Nora looked at each of us in turn before she answered, and I remember thinking, even then, that whatever fear she might have felt, she wasn't going to let it stop her from trying. Then we've lost nothing we weren't already going to lose, she said. But if there's even a chance their own procedure requires them to consider a properly presented response, then we have to try. Somebody has to be the first subject species that talks back. 11 weeks remained before the vessel arrived. 11 weeks to translate an entirely new argument into a language none of us had learned to write, only to read. 11 weeks to carve, somewhere on this planet, in stone durable enough to last until the moment of final judgment, an answer that no cultivator had ever expected to receive. Nora picked up a piece of chalk and began sketching the first structure of the new symbol sequence directly onto the chamber wall, her hand moving with a kind of certainty I hadn't seen in her since the very first day she found that shifting spiral carved in the mud. They wrote the rules assuming nobody would ever read them in time to respond, she said, almost to herself. We're going to prove that assumption wrong. None of us said anything else that night. There wasn't anything left to say. The only thing left to do was begin. Carving a language nobody had ever written before turned out to be far harder than translating one that already existed. Grant spent the first 10 days simply mapping the grammatical rules Nora believed the cultivator script followed, testing each theory against every fragment we had gathered from sites across the world. He built entire structures of logic around single repeated symbols, trying to determine whether they behaved like nouns, verbs, or something closer to legal terminology, with no direct equivalent in any human language. Every mistake meant starting over. Every breakthrough felt fragile, like it might collapse under closer scrutiny the way so many of our early theories already had. Lucy focused on precedent, searching every translated fragment we possessed for any hint of a subject species that had responded to the trial in any way at all, hoping to find some structural template we could follow. She found nothing. 18 previous species, and not one of them had left behind even a fragment suggesting they understood what was happening in time to respond. "We're not adapting an existing argument," she told us one evening, exhausted after another day finding nothing but silence in the historical record. "We're building the first one that's ever existed." Daniel tracked the vessel's approach constantly, updating the countdown that hung above our workstation like a heartbeat none of us could ignore. 9 weeks, then 7, then 5, after the vessel adjusted its trajectory again, shaving critical days off a deadline that already felt impossibly short. And Nora worked longer hours than any of us, refining the argument itself, the actual substance of what we intended to carve into stone. She rewrote entire sections a dozen times, discarding phrasing that leaned too close to pleading, insisting instead on language that framed humanity's differences as evidence of resilience rather than apology for our failure to conform. "We're not asking for mercy," she reminded us constantly, whenever exhaustion tempted anyone toward softer language. "We're presenting evidence. There's a difference, and if we get that difference wrong, we lose before they even finish reading it." By the 6th week, we had a full draft translated into symbol structure, spanning nearly 40 individual glyphs arranged in a sequence Grant believed matched the formal grammatical pattern used in the deepest chambers, describing legal procedure. The core of the argument stated, as precisely as we could translate it, that variation across a species should be measured as adaptive strength rather than instability, that disagreement and conflict, resolved through negotiation rather than uniform control, demonstrated a higher capacity for long-term survival than convergence toward a single controlled pattern ever could. We had the words. What we didn't have yet was somewhere permanent enough to carve them, somewhere the cultivators would actually see them upon arrival. "It has to be at the primary site," Nora said, standing in front of a map showing every known chamber location. "The vessel's trajectory is aligned with the hollow specifically. That's not coincidence. That's where they're planning to conduct final assessment." Which meant we had 5 weeks remaining to carve an entirely new message into stone, durable enough to survive, positioned somewhere inside a chamber that governments across the world were only barely allowing civilian access to anymore, given how quickly military interest in the site had grown once the incoming vessel was confirmed. Getting authorization took nearly a full week of negotiation Nora handled almost entirely herself, arguing directly with officials who understood the stakes but remained deeply skeptical that carving a response into ancient stone could accomplish anything against a civilization capable of crossing interstellar distances to conduct planetary assessments. I sat beside her through most of those meetings, watching her hold her ground against officials who outranked everyone in that room, refusing to back down even when they questioned whether the entire plan was a waste of time we no longer had. "You have a better option?" she finally asked one exhausted colonel who kept pushing back against the proposal. "Because I haven't heard one yet. We can carve an answer using the only language they've ever proven willing to communicate in, or we can wait quietly for a verdict none of us have any ability to influence otherwise. Those are the only 2 choices on the table." She got her authorization. 4 weeks remained. The physical carving itself required equipment far more precise than anything the original excavation team had used, tools capable of etching detailed symbol structures into the same ancient stone material the cultivators themselves had used. Material scans confirmed was nothing like natural rock found anywhere else on the planet. Engineers worked alongside Grant and Nora around the clock, translating digital symbol structures into physical carving patterns, testing each tool against sample fragments before risking a single mistake on the actual chamber wall. 3 weeks remained when the first section of the new inscription was completed, a section describing humanity's history of internal conflict, not as failure, but as an ongoing process of negotiation between competing ideas. A mechanism that had allowed the species to correct catastrophic mistakes across generations rather than repeating them blindly under a single unchanging authority. 2 weeks remained when Daniel's monitoring station detected the first unmistakable sign that the vessel's approach had shifted again, decelerating faster than any previous model predicted. "It's not slowing down for orbital insertion," he said, running the numbers 3 times before he trusted them enough to speak. "It's slowing down like it already knows exactly where it's going, like something is guiding it directly toward this specific location." "How much time do we actually have?" Nora asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately, and the silence told me everything before he finally spoke. 6 days, he said. "Maybe less. 6 days to complete an inscription originally planned across a full month of careful, precise work." Nora didn't hesitate. She moved the entire team into round-the-clock shifts, sleeping in short bursts on cots set up directly inside the chamber, refusing to leave the carving unattended even for a few hours of rest. I remember the 4th night most clearly, standing beside her while she worked through exhaustion so severe her hands trembled against the etching tool, refining a single symbol sequence describing collaborative disagreement, the specific concept she believed mattered most to the entire argument. "You need to sleep," I told her, not for the first time. "I'll sleep when it's finished," she said, the same answer she'd given every time I'd asked. "And if it's not finished in time—" She paused, tool still resting against the stone, and looked at me with an exhaustion so deep it had passed straight through fear and out the other side into something calmer, something almost peaceful in its determination. "Then it's not finished," she said. "But we'll have tried. 18 other species never even got that chance." On the 5th day, with roughly 70% of the inscription complete, the ground began to shake. Not an earthquake. Not a collapse. A vibration low and steady, growing stronger by the hour. The kind of tremor that comes from something massive entering atmosphere at controlled velocity rather than crashing uncontrolled. Daniel's monitoring station confirmed it within minutes. "They're early," he said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The vessel is already inside the atmosphere. Estimated arrival at this location within 18 hours. 18 hours, with roughly a third of the inscription still incomplete. Nora didn't panic. I watched her absorb the information, take one long breath, and immediately redirect the entire team toward the most essential remaining sections, prioritizing the core argument over supporting detail, focusing everyone's remaining strength on ensuring the central message would be readable even if the surrounding context remained unfinished. "Grant, focus on the redundancy argument," she said. "That's the core of everything. If they only read one section, it has to be that one. And the rest? We finish what we can, we leave what we can't." The final 18 hours blurred together in a way I still find difficult to describe accurately. Engineers worked in rotating shifts, exhaustion pushed aside by adrenaline, neither medicine nor rest could replicate. Military personnel outside the chamber reported the vessel's descent in increasingly urgent updates, confirming its trajectory remained locked directly on our location, exactly as Nora had predicted weeks earlier. 4 hours before the estimated arrival, the vessel became visible from the surface, a shape unlike anything any aircraft or spacecraft humanity had ever produced, moving with a silent, deliberate grace that felt somehow more unsettling than any noise could have been. Global news channels captured footage within minutes, the entire world watching in real time as something ancient and unmistakably intelligent descended toward a research site most of the public had only recently learned existed at all. Inside the chamber, Nora worked on the final section of the inscription, hands steady despite 5 days without proper sleep, carving the closing passage of an argument that no subject species had ever presented before. I stood beside her, watching the vibration in the ground grow stronger with every passing minute, watching the last remaining symbols take shape under a hand that refused to stop moving even as the entire world above us held its breath. "How much longer?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the growing tremor. "Almost done," she said, not looking up. "Almost done." The vessel touched down less than 200 meters from the excavation site with barely a sound, an impossible landing for something clearly massive enough to be visible from orbit. Military personnel outside reported no visible propulsion, no impact, nothing, except the sudden absolute stillness of something ancient, settling gently onto the surface of a world it had seeded 19 separate times. Nora finished the final symbol exactly as the ground stopped shaking entirely. She stepped back from the wall, breathing hard, staring at the completed inscription glowing faintly under the chamber lights, an argument written entirely in a language no human had ever been taught to speak, carved by hands that had never once, until that moment, been given the chance to answer back. Outside, something began moving toward the chamber entrance. "They're here," Daniel's voice crackled over the radio, tight with barely controlled tension. "Something is approaching the excavation site directly. It knows exactly where to go." Nora turned to look at the rest of us, exhaustion and determination mixing together in an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. "Good," she said quietly. "Let them read it." I had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways over the past months, and none of them prepared me for how quiet it actually was. No weapons raised, no dramatic descent through the ceiling, just a narrow opening forming in the chamber's outer wall where solid rock simply reorganized itself into a doorway, as though the stone itself remembered how to fold open after being closed for longer than human civilization had existed. Through that opening came a presence rather than a figure, something that moved without quite touching the ground, tall and composed of shifting light, held together in a shape roughly humanoid, though nothing about it felt remotely familiar. Nobody in that chamber moved. Nora stood closest to the inscription, and I remember reaching for her hand without thinking, the two of us standing together in front of the wall she had spent the last 6 days carving, watching an intelligence older than written history approach the argument she had built to answer it. The cultivator paused at the threshold, and for a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened at all. Then it turned toward the wall, toward the fresh symbols still faintly warm from the carving tools, and it went completely still. I don't know how long it studied the inscription. Time seemed to stretch strangely in that chamber, minutes feeling like hours, every breath loud in the silence. Grant stood frozen beside Daniel, both of them watching the presence read words that had never once, across 18 previous subject species and untold thousands of years, been offered to any cultivator before. When it finally moved again, it turned toward Nora directly, and though it had no face I could clearly describe, I felt certain, in some way I couldn't explain, that it was looking specifically at her. A voice arrived not through sound, but through something closer to direct understanding, forming in my mind in a way that bypassed my ears entirely, though I somehow knew every person in that chamber heard the exact same words at the exact same moment. Response acknowledged. Response unprecedented. Clarification required before proceeding. Nora stepped forward, and I felt my heart pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. "We understand the terms of the trial," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "We're not asking you to ignore them. We're presenting evidence that your measurement of success has been incomplete. Clarify basis for claim." Nora gestured toward the inscription, toward the section describing redundancy through disagreement, the argument she had built the entire case around. "You measure convergence as strength," she said. "A species that thinks with one mind, moves with one purpose, avoids internal conflict. But convergence is fragile. One mistake, one flawed idea, accepted without challenge, and an entire convergent species collapses together because nothing exists to correct the error before it spreads unchecked. Divergence measured previously as instability across 18 designations, consistent failure indicator. Because every previous species tried to hide their divergence, Nora said. They tried to appear stable because they thought that's what you wanted to see. We're not hiding ours. We're telling you it's the reason we've survived every disaster that should have ended us permanently, plagues that should have erased entire populations, collapses that should have ended civilizations completely. We survived because different groups tried different solutions simultaneously, and when one approach failed, others existed to take its place. A single unified mind has no redundancy. Ours does. The silence that followed felt different than before, less like judgment being withheld and more like genuine consideration, as though something ancient and enormous was actually weighing an argument for the first time in longer than any of us could comprehend. Claim requires verification against historical record. Then verify it, Nora said. Everything I've told you is already written into our own history. Every plague we survived through variation in immune response. Every collapse we recovered from through different regions adopting different strategies simultaneously. Every war that ended not through one side's total dominance, but through negotiation between fundamentally different perspectives, learning to coexist. We are not converging toward a single controlled pattern, and we never will. That resistance to convergence is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of a species built to survive precisely the kind of catastrophic single points of failure that convergence guarantees eventually. I watched the presence remain motionless for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time, and I realized, standing there, that we had no idea what would happen if it simply disagreed. No idea whether presenting an argument at all carried any risk beyond the verdict we were already facing. Nora had built an entire case on the assumption that a species capable of establishing formal trial procedure would also respect formal challenge to that procedure, but there had never been any guarantee that assumption was correct. Precedent protocol located, the voice finally said. Formal challenge to assessment criteria never previously presented by any subject designation. Procedural requirement confirmed. Challenge must be evaluated against original cultivation objective before verdict finalized. What was the original objective? Nora asked. Determine whether cultivated species demonstrates capacity for continued independent development without requiring further intervention or termination. Then that's exactly what you're looking at, Nora said. A species capable of identifying the trial itself, understanding the language it was written in, and constructing a formal response within the procedure you established, all without any guidance or intervention from you. If independent development is truly what you're measuring, then the very fact that we're standing here, answering you directly instead of waiting silently for judgment, should already answer the question you came to ask. Another long silence followed, and this time, I felt Nora's hand tighten around mine, the first sign of nerves she had allowed herself to show since the presence first appeared. Claim demonstrates independent procedural comprehension exceeding all previous cultivation designations, the voice finally said. Reassessment of convergence criteria required. Recommendation pending review against full historical record. Recommendation, Nora repeated carefully, meaning the verdict isn't final yet. Verdict requires complete evaluation, estimated evaluation duration, insufficient data for precise calculation. How long, approximately? Daniel asked from behind us, his voice shaking slightly despite his obvious effort to sound composed. Evaluation of full historical divergence pattern against revised criteria estimated at several solar cycles. Years, Grant translated quietly. It needs years to properly evaluate everything Nora just presented. Correct assessment. Cultivation status suspended pending complete evaluation. Termination protocol withheld during evaluation period. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months, a tension I hadn't fully realized I was carrying until that exact moment. Termination protocol withheld. Whatever happened next, whatever years of evaluation still lay ahead, the immediate threat that had hung over our entire planet for months had, at least for now, been paused. And after the evaluation, Nora asked, what happens if you determine our argument is correct? Subject designation 19 would represent first successful challenge to established cultivation protocol in recorded history. Precedent would apply retroactively to future designations under evaluation. You mean other worlds? Lucy said quietly. Other species still being seeded right now, somewhere else. Confirmed. Multiple designations currently within observation phase across separate cultivated worlds. I hadn't considered, until that exact moment, that our argument might mean something far larger than simply saving our own planet. If Nora's challenge succeeded, if the cultivators genuinely revised the standard they used to measure every species under their observation, other worlds we would likely never know existed might benefit from an argument built entirely inside a collapsing excavation tunnel by people who had never expected to become the first defense attorneys for an entire planet. The presence remained a moment longer, and I sensed, though I couldn't explain exactly how, that it was studying Nora specifically, the person who had built an argument no previous species had ever thought to attempt. Designation 19 demonstrates unprecedented capacity for procedural engagement. Formal notation will be recorded within Cultivation Archive. A section of the wall beside our inscription began to shift, stone reorganizing itself the same way the entrance had, forming a new set of symbols directly beside the ones Nora had carved. An official acknowledgement written by the cultivators themselves, permanently marking our response as part of the same ancient record that had once described us only as Subject Designation 19, awaiting final judgment. Evaluation will proceed. Designation 19 will be revisited upon completion. And then, as quietly as it had arrived, the presence turned and moved back through the opening in the chamber wall, the doorway sealing shut behind it, the same way it had appeared, stone folding closed over an entrance that would likely remain hidden again for years, possibly longer. Outside, the vessel lifted away from the surface, with the same eerie silence it had used to land, rising steadily until it disappeared entirely from view, leaving behind nothing but a slightly disturbed patch of ground and an entire species that had, for the first time in its recorded existence, spoken directly to the intelligence that planted it. Nobody in that chamber said anything for a long time. I think we were all waiting for something else to happen, some confirmation that we hadn't simply imagined the entire encounter. But the only proof that remained was the fresh inscription glowing faintly on the wall, human argument standing directly beside an ancient acknowledgement neither of us had ever expected to actually receive. Nora finally sat down on the chamber floor, exhaustion catching up to her all at once, now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. I sat down beside her, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "We don't actually know if we won," she finally said quietly. "No," I agreed, "but we know they're listening now. That's more than any other species ever got." She smiled, faint and exhausted, staring up at the inscription she had spent 6 days carving under a deadline that had nearly killed her before she finished it. 18 other worlds never had this chance, she said. 18 species lived and grew and disappeared, and none of them ever knew enough to answer back. And now every species still being observed benefits from what you did here, I said. Whether we win or lose, that part already happened. In the months that followed, life continued in ways that felt strange given everything we now understood about our place, in a much larger, much older story than any of us had grown up believing. Governments quietly funded continued research into every chamber found across the world, translating fragments that would likely take decades to fully understand. Daniel continued monitoring for any sign the vessel, or others like it, might return sooner than expected. Grant and Lucy expanded their work into a permanent research division, dedicated entirely to understanding a language none of us had known existed a little over a year earlier. Nora never stopped working, though something in her had changed after that encounter, a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before, as though carrying the knowledge that she had personally spoken for an entire species had settled into her in a way that made everything afterward feel smaller by comparison. I asked her once, months later, sitting together in the same reinforced chamber where everything had happened, whether she thought we would ever know the actual outcome of the evaluation, whether humanity would eventually receive a final verdict, confirming survival, or something far worse. She thought about it for a long time before answering, staring at the inscription that still glowed faintly along the chamber wall, human words standing permanently beside the acknowledgement left by beings who had planted our entire species as an experiment thousands of years before any of us were born. "I don't know if we'll ever get a final answer," she said, "but I know we stopped being a silent test subject the moment we carved that wall. Whatever they eventually decide, They'll decide it knowing we understood exactly what was happening, and we answered anyway. I think about that conversation often, especially now, years later, whenever I walk past the sealed chamber that still holds humanity's only conversation with the intelligence that planted our entire world as a trial we never agreed to take part in. The stones are still there, exactly as they've always been, carved by beings who never expected an answer. But now, standing right beside them, carved by a woman who refused to wait quietly for judgment, our answer stands too. We didn't pass their test. We ended it.